This past week, Ubisoft ran into some controversy surrounding Assassin's Creed Odyssey and what they did for the ending of a DLC chapter, revolving around the player's choice or lack thereof. Now, while the usual suspects here on YouTube and around were quick to ask what the big deal was, this does represent a really big deal when it comes to player choice and kind of considerations about when you're giving the player freedom and what that means to take it away. And this is a trap that we see a lot of major studios run into when it comes to trying to promote choice and diversity, and sometimes end up stumbling and tripping over. So, when it comes to video games, there is always that unspoken rule or contract between developer and consumer. As a developer, it's your job to present your game in the best possible version, make it as bug-free as possible, etc., etc. As a consumer, you must adhere to the rules and constraints of the game space. If you're playing as a bloodthirsty mutant, you can't complain about a game not having a let's all sit down, have a cup of tea option in it. And for a lot of video games out there, we deal with linear experiences. You go from point A to point Z, have a few cutscenes, fight some bosses, get the ending, the game's over. You can't exactly tell Mario, stop chasing after Peach and go take a drive on a vacation somewhere. But this is where the power of choice comes into play when it comes to game development and the perception of a game. Now, we've talked about choice in the forms of either personalization or customization. Personalization is anything that is non-gameplay impacting. So, hair color, clothing options, your gender, your favorite pet, what's your favorite food, stuff like that. While customization refers to gameplay impacting choices. What ending did you pick? What's your archetype, skill tree, talent trees, perk trees, you name it, anything that involves trees like that. And these choices are a very big deal. Because whenever you let the player essentially define their experience, even if it's something as small as what color hat they have, these elements do matter when it comes for the player to kind of represent themselves or their own specific play style within this space. Now, we'll be talking about gameplay impacting choices in the second half of this video. But for what's going on with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, this is going to be as as spoiler as free as we can make it, I guess. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the big marketing push was that you can choose between two named and fully developed characters, one man, one woman, and they're unique and they have their own story to play, and then you can further influence that story based on the decisions you make, who you decide to have a relationship with, if you have a relationship, etc., etc. But for the most part, or as the game was marketed, you were free to define these characters however you wish within the constraints of the game. So what the DLC did was basically introduce a situation where the character was essentially forced to get married, and more specifically, forced to get married to a member of the opposite sex to have a child. Now, for the people who played their characters, straight, this wasn't that big of a deal. But if you were playing your character to not get in a relationship, or if you were going for a same-sex relationship, this was basically just taking your choice and throwing it out the window. And that is a very big no-no when it comes to game design. Players are very angry and they do not like it if you tell them that their choices don't matter. This is again why I fell out of love with the Telltale games when I came to realize that all those "they will remember it" messages don't mean squat. And when it comes to choice, it has to be represented in-game. That's the other factor here, and that's going to lead us into the second part of this topic, or the second example. That every choice you let the player make, it has to have some kind of in-game impact. Even if it's, again, going back to the hat example, that my character wears a hat in all the cutscenes. Or so-and-so joins us because we recruited them. You don't want characters just kind of like appear and disappear just because you force the story to be like that. And again, players are willing to accept a linear story and linear set of events if they don't have to make any choices between there. But if you start offering them options, like do you save this person, or do you go this way, do you fight this, etc., they're going to naturally assume that that's going to matter. And when it doesn't, again, you are going to end up upsetting more people than not having those decisions. And the other big example of this is obviously the Mass Effect trilogy, which BioWare's Mega 3-game epic tried to fit in 3 games worth of decisions and who do you save, who do you kill, how do you respond, and all that, and then condense it all down to 3 endings. Now, with that said, I know somebody's about to point out it would be crazy to assume that they could count for every permutation that was added into that game. And that's the point. The more you add, the more you have to represent within that title. And the problem that Mass Effect and BioWare had was they basically put the cart before the horse. That so many of those options, there's just no real way of making a game that to accommodate for all of them. Now, when we talk about this, we're not talking about in the short term, as in you piss somebody off, they say, I don't like you, and then it all goes back to normal 10 minutes later. We're talking about choices that will actually impact the story going forward. Even if it's as simple as a character referencing something you did 10 to 15 hours ago. As long as the player sees that their choices are actually impacting the flow of the story and the gameplay, they're going to be happy with that. But with something like Mass Effect, there was no way that 3 endings was going to accommodate that. Maybe they could have done that with like 3 to 5 more years of development, who knows. But again, when you're throwing in all these different elements together, you cannot leave them basically hanging and expect players to be okay with that. And one of the better examples of a game kind of mattering along those lines was Prey 2017, 2016, I always forget that year. But in that game, you still only, well, I guess, spoiler warning, there's only 2, I guess, canonical endings, or quote-unquote canonical endings in Prey. But the game gives you kind of like its own interpretation of a grading screen with characters referencing everything that you did. And what they kind of did was go with very broad categories. But those separate broad categories had a lot of little elements that would matter in them. And that would all basically factor into how this character would respond to you. And in this way, this was kind of Arcane's way of tricking the player in the fact that yes, their choices mattered, but it mattered into these like separate groupings. But again, the fact that the game would reference them and would comment gave that illusion of choice. And as we've talked about before in the Bandersnatch video, it is an illusion of choice. No matter how great of a developer you are, you cannot give the player complete free will. It just is not going to happen when it comes to from a storytelling or personalization standpoint. Everything is still being defined by the development and by the design. But with that said, we're going to switch over and talk a little bit more about things from a gameplay or game affecting angle next. But as always, a quick shout out to our Patreon backers. Thank you to our Patreon backers, and if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, check out our Discord channel, linked down below. When we're talking about gameplay choices, things are both simpler but also complicated at the same time. And choice when it comes to gameplay or customization options are really seen at their fullest and their hardest in the ARPG genre, aiming to some extent the CCG genre as well. What we have here is Grim Dawn for my play of the expansion. And with this game, there are a lot of choices you have to make. Now you have to choose what your primary and secondary masteries are. You have to choose what skills to level up, what constellation, or I guess like destiny points you have to add, and of course not to mention all the loot that you pick up. And all that together adds up into your own customized build. But again, the problem or the challenge when it comes to gameplay impacting choices is that you always have to have that thought in the back of your mind as to whether or not an ability is too strong or too weak. The player should never feel like a skill that they chose is considered quote-unquote wrong. as in the game is just designed, or an encounter has no way of working with how this character built their character. If I want to be a range character or a close range, the game must be designed with a wide enough net to accommodate for both. With that said though, you don't want choices to be too powerful. As in, there should be no reason to do range because melee works every time, or vice versa. And that's another big point that a lot of ARPG developers tend to mess up with when it comes to their games. They'll make so many range enemies, so many crowds and AoE skills, and not give melee characters any out. And what ends up happening is that it's just safer and easier to stand back and shoot guns, or in this case, rain down the ice-based death from above. But, as I'm sure you're all about to point out, if you make things too great, why should the player choose anything else? If lightning damage is all-encompassing, perfect, cannot be blocked, cannot be countered, why should I ever choose ice? Some of you will probably say, well, there's always a thematic reason. Going back again to personalization. There are people who will define entire elaborate backstories for their characters, and then you have a guy like me who will just say, does this character have brown hair? Good, we're done. Let's get into the real game. But, again, gamers will not willingly hinder themselves or handicap themselves when it comes to playing a game. Because who would want to choose skills that are purposely weaker and then run the risk of having their game fail? This is another issue that we run into with CRPG games, that they will front load all those choices in the beginning, and then guess what? You chose that wrong option 10 minutes in the game, and now you're screwed at hour 35. Now, balancing skills like this, definitely too big of a discussion for this video. We'll probably have to do another one on it in the meantime. But keeping with this thought or this discussion about making the player's choices matter and avoiding those issues, good game design will usually give each ability its own overpowered feature. And the game is kind of balanced by the fact that it's not balanced. And yes, that's another statement that makes perfect sense, I know. But the general idea is that each ability should feel powerful. It should feel like you're breaking the game in this own specific way. And a specific way is the major phrase here. Again, the player should not be able to do everything. They should not be the ultimate range, melee, spellcaster, assassin, healer, buffer, tanker, all together. But if I define my character as, in this case, a range with these ice traps, then that's my niche. That's what I should be feeling all-powerful for. If I design my character as a dodge, attack speed mastering, dual-wielding assassin, then I should be feeling powerful like that, but in a different way. And again, it's not easy to do this, whether from a storytelling or from a gameplay point of view. Because, for again, every choice you add into your game, you have to accommodate and take account for when you're designing. For storytelling, again, it's how the story plays out. If I define my character as someone who is going to be a lone wolf, then you better not end the game with my character, settling down and having 10 children. And from a gameplay point of view, if I say my character is ice-based here, then you better not give me 5 hours of nothing but ice-immune enemies to fight. And again, there's so much more we can talk about this topic, but we're going to begin to wrap it up here. Going back to the original point about Ubisoft, and even to some extent with Mass Effect and BioWare, these kinds of issues, quite frankly, should be easy to spot. Again, if you're on one hand telling the player that their choices matter, then you cannot, on the other hand, start throwing in elements that will remove or retcon those choices away. And it sounds like Ubisoft is preparing to do, or they're going to do, a re-release or a patch or an update to that DLC to make it a little bit clearer as to what's going on. And again, it is more work and it does suck for the developers in question, but on the other hand, you cannot promote choice and letting the player's actions matter and then take that away. Like we said in the first part, it is better in hindsight to design a game that is 100% linear and hard-coded and not let any choices matter, rather than say that choices matter and don't do anything with it. Now, when it comes to how far to offer these choices, again, when we talked about personalization, it's basically how people will define themselves. And in today's market, that does include having LGBTQ plus options. And I know a few of you watching this right now probably got a sneer on your face when I said that phrase. But remember, if you are trying to market your game to as wide of a market as possible, then you need to account for that diversity. Because again, you cannot say you have diversity on one hand and not offer it on the other. But with that said, we're going to wrap it up here. And for people watching, what are some of your favorite examples of games that offered a very wide net in terms of choices? And are there any other bad examples of games that promise choice or the player's actions mattering and then not living up to it? But thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to check out our Discord and all that linked down below. If you'd like to suggest a topic for me to look at in the future, please don't hesitate to get in touch and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Till next time, take care. If you're looking for another book about game design, be sure to check out my first title, 20 Essential Games to Study, out now. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel linked down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.